If you are listening to this right now, I actually need you to do something before we even start.
Yeah, hit that like button.
Exactly. Hit the like button and make sure you are subscribed to the feed. We're about to wade into some incredibly heavy territory today.
Controversial territory.
Very controversial. And to be honest, the algorithm does not like what the source material is about to say.
Right.
We are engaging in a battle of substance over slop here, so you need to help us keep the signal strong.
Absolutely. Your support matters more than ever with a topic like this. It really helps us bypass the gatekeepers.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We are taking a deep dive today into a source that, well, it isn't really just a book.
No, it reads more like a war cry.
Right. It's an ebook titled Four Horsemen, Fourth Turning, Apocalypse, and Reckoning. And the author is Conrad Riker. And I have to say, going through this text,
Intense.
it is. It felt less like reading an ebook and more like having someone grab you by the shoulders and physically shake you awake. It's incredibly aggressive.
It's a jarring text, but that's entirely by design. Riker isn't interested in being polite or pulling punches. He explicitly frames this work as a survival manual for a very specific kind of person.
Specifically for men.
Right, for men who feel this, he calls it a gnawing sensation that the world outside their window isn't just changing, it's dying.
That specific line really stuck with me because he talks about how the media and these bureaucratic overlords act like everything is perfectly fine. The stock market is up, everyone is supposedly happy.
But he calls that an anesthetic.
Exactly. He says the patient, which in his metaphor is a Western civilization, has already lost its limbs and we are just being heavily drugged so we don't scream.
Yeah, and this brings us right to the core premise of the title, the fourth turning. For those who know the theory, it's this concept that history moves in these predictable cycles. You have the high, the awakening, the unraveling, and finally, the crisis.
And Riker argues we are deep, deep in the crisis phase.
Right. But here is the hook of his argument. He claims that the collapse we are seeing right now in the economy, in gender relations, in our culture, it is not an accident.
It's not just bad luck.
No, he argues it is a structural inevitability. He says it was caused by the intentional adoption of cultural Marxism and what he calls the complete gynocentric capture of all our institutions.
He really pulls no punches with that. He basically tells the reader, look, the old world is burning. You cannot save it. You just have to survive it.
Yes, and I want to be very clear right off the bat here. We are going to cover the main pillars of his argument today, but we can really only scratch the surface of the data he presents in the text.
It's a dense read.
Very dense. If you want the full tactical map, the actual manual on how to navigate this collapse he's describing, you need to go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now and buy Four Horsemen by Conrad Riker.
Yeah, what we are discussing today is truly just the tip of the iceberg.
So let's start where the text starts. He outlines the first horseman.
The pestilence of the mind.
Right. And he traces this ideological infection all the way back to the 1930s.
Which, I mean, that seems like ancient history for a book that's primarily about modern social collapse. Why start there?
Because according to Riker, that is exactly where the virus was engineered. He does this really deep historical dive into the Frankfurt School. And this is crucial for understanding the rest of his argument. He points to figures like Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and Herbert Marcuse.
These are the German Marxist intellectuals who fled to Columbia University back in the 30s, right?
Exactly.
And his argument is that they didn't come to the West with tanks and guns. They came with a philosophy.
A weaponized philosophy. They called it critical theory. See, the text explains that traditional Marxism was always about economics, the workers seizing the factories. But that didn't work in the West because the middle class was just too comfortable.
They had cars and refrigerators. They didn't want a violent revolution.
Right. So Riker explains that these intellectuals shifted the battlefield from economics directly to culture. He argues that critical theory wasn't designed to build anything at all. Its sole purpose was a poison pill.
To deconstruct Western culture.
Specifically Christianity, the nuclear family, and patriarchal authority. The goal was to criticize every single aspect of Western society until it completely lost its legitimacy in the eyes of the public.
And this is where he brings up this phrase, the long march through the institutions.
Yes, originally coined by Rudy Duschke, but heavily inspired by Antonio Gramsci. The strategy was simple but insidious. You don't fight a violent revolution in the streets where you can be defeated. You take a much longer path.
You capture the culture factories.
Exactly. You quietly take over the universities, the media, the seminaries, the HR departments. You rot the structural supports from the inside out without ever firing a shot.
And one of the most fascinating concepts he links to this, and honestly see this playing out every single day online, is Marcuse's idea of repressive tolerance. Can you explain that? Because on its face, it sounds like a complete contradiction in terms.
It is a contradiction, and Riker points out that that is exactly the point. Marcuse explicitly argued that to have a truly liberated society, you cannot actually be tolerant of everyone. You have to be repressively tolerant.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning society is conditioned to be totally permissive of left-wing radicalism, things like violent protest or the censorship of traditional values, while simultaneously being actively intolerant of any right-wing movements.
But when we see conservative voices getting aggressively deplatformed, while radical activists get promoted or celebrated.
Riker argues that is not a glitch in the system. That is the operating system itself. It is Marcuse's theory applied directly to modern big tech and media.
It's why one side of the political spectrum is immediately labeled hate speech, and the other side is just called justice.
Right. The text says it's designed to silence any opposition by preemptively labeling it as intolerant.
It's the software running the simulation right now. But what I found really interesting is how Riker gets very specific about when this ideological capture became a literal legal weapon against men. He circles a very specific date on the calendar, April 4th, 2011.
Yes.
Why that specific day? What happened?
That was the day the Dear Colleague letter was sent out.
Okay, remind us what that was, because that's a huge pivot point in the book.
This was a directive from the Obama administration's Office for Civil Rights. It unilaterally redefined Title IX regulations for every university receiving federal funding. Historically, Western law is based on the concept of beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right, you need like 99% certainty to convict someone of a crime.
Exactly. But this letter forced universities to judge sexual misconduct cases based on a preponderance of the evidence.
Which means what exactly in practical terms? In numbers.
It means 50.01% certainty. It is essentially a feather on the scale. Riker argues that this policy effectively created kangaroo courts and star chambers on college campuses. It completely stripped men of their right to due process just to appease a feminist narrative.
Because if a woman accuses you, and the campus administrator feels she is slightly more likely to be telling the truth than not,
You are expelled. Your academic life is completely over.
and there is no cross-examination allowed, no strict evidence standards.
In many of these cases, no, none at all. Riker asserts that the system was fundamentally redesigned to presume guilt because the concept of quote-unquote believing women became a massive political imperative that completely overrode the search for objective truth.
He has a term for this in the book. He calls it theatrocracy. I thought that was a brilliant term.
Yeah, a system governed by theater. It is no longer about objective facts. It is about who can perform victimhood the most effectively. He points to the Duke Lacrosse case and the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings as his prime examples of this.
The Kavanaugh example was particularly intense in the text. He describes the whole media circus as a ritual of humiliation.
He sees it as a coordinated attempt to destroy a high-status male based on uncorroborated memories. And he argues the purpose wasn't even about Kavanaugh specifically. It was purely to signal the immense power of the matriarchy.
To show that they can do it to anyone.
Right. The book claims it creates a world where men are terrified to interact, knowing that a mere accusation is practically as good as a conviction. He calls it psychological warfare designed to keep men docile.
So that covers the institutional layer. That's the legal trap he describes. But then the book pivots to what I personally found to be the most provocative section. He talks about the clash between the software, which is society's programming, and the hardware.
Biological reality.
Yeah.
This is the absolute red pill core of the book.
Yeah.
Riker argues that while the media constantly tries to reprogram men to be soft, compliant allies and tries to reprogram women to be independent girl bosses, you simply cannot reprogram biology.
The hardware eventually overrides the software.
Always. And he uses James Donmore as his main case study here.
The Google memo guy.
Right. Back in 2017, Damore, who was a software engineer, wrote this internal memo. He basically suggested that the gender gap in tech might actually be due to biological differences in interests and traits. You know, men generally having a higher interest in things and women having a higher interest in people rather than it just being a result of systemic sexism.
And Google fired him immediately.
He was burned at the stake for heresy. Riker uses this to argue that we are currently living in a religious cult, not a rational, fact-based society. If you speak biological truth, you are destroyed.
But then Riker goes even deeper into the hardware of human relationships.
Mm-hmm.
He brings up this concept called Briffault's Law.
Yes.
I actually hadn't heard of this one before. The quote in the book is, "The female, not the male, determines all the conditions of the animal family."
Robert Briffault. He wrote that in 1927. The law basically states that if the female derives no benefit from the association ends.
It's ruthless.
It is. Riker uses this concept to completely strip away what he calls the Disney lie of unconditional love. He argues that female love is fundamentally transactional. It is entirely based on hypergamy.
Okay, we need to unpack hypergamy because he uses some very specific, very internet-native terminology in this section. He talks about alpha fucks, beta bucks. It sounds incredibly crude on the surface.
It is crude terminology, but Riker insists it is the most accurate model for understanding modern mating strategies. He argues that women have a dual mating strategy literally embedded in their DNA.
Strategy one being what?
Strategy one is seeking genetic superiority, the alphas. This is for short-term mating. It's driven by raw physical attraction, lust, the desire for good genes.
And strategy two.
Strategy two kicks in when they seek provision and safety, the betas. This is for long-term security.
Okay, I follow.
Now, Riker's main argument here is that the modern state has completely broken the historical balance of this dynamic. The welfare state and the biased family courts now allow women to have the alpha experience in their youth without any of the traditional consequences.
And then they just use the legal system to extract resources from the beta provider later on.
Exactly. Or they just rely on the state itself to act as a surrogate husband.
So the average guy is just getting squeezed from both sides.
He's expected to physically and financially pay for a system that actively despises him. And Riker is highly critical of how a lot of modern men have responded to this squeeze. This is where he dives into what he calls the simp economy.
Oh, right, the misandry bubble.
He looks at the explosion of platforms like OnlyFans. He describes this phenomenon as men artificially inflating the value of women. Millions of men are transferring hard resources their money without receiving any actual intimacy, commitment, or reproductive value in return.
It's just a terrible trait.
It's economically irrational behavior, and Riker says it's entirely driven by male desperation in a broken market.
It's a massive economic distortion. And he heavily contrasts this simp economy with the concept of the sexual market value curve, or what he calls the wall.
This is one of the hard truths he really wants his male readers to internalize. Riker argues that a woman's value in the mating market is inextricably tethered to youth and fertility. It peaks early, usually between 18 and 25, and then it depreciates.
And he says that's just raw biology, regardless of what Cosmopolitan magazine tries to tell you.
Right. But men, on the other hand...
Men are an appreciating asset.
Exactly. A man's value is based on his status, his resources, and his competence. And those things take time to build. So a man's value naturally peaks much later, in his 30s and 40s.
So Riker's overarching point here is that young men are miserable right now because they haven't built their value yet. But they shouldn't despair.
They need to grind. They need to build themselves up and realize that time is actually on their side. But only if they don't waste their 20s being a simp or chasing validation from women who fundamentally do not respect them.
And that perfectly brings us to the solution presented in the text. Because a lot of guys read this stuff, they read that the legal system is totally rigged against them, the culture hates their masculinity, dating is an absolute minefield, and they just want to give up.
They want to take the black pill.
Right, and Riker's very, very firm on this point. You must reject the black pill.
Nihilism is just another form of losing. It is exactly what the corrupt system wants you to do. They want you to rot quietly in a corner and not cause any trouble. Instead, Riker proposes taking the iron pill.
I really love that distinction, the iron pill. Break that down for us. What does that actually look like?
It starts with embracing the concept of creative destruction. He quotes the economist Joseph Schumpeter here. The core idea is that the ongoing collapse of these parasitic institutions, the gynocentric state, the corrupted university system, the legacy media, it is actually a good thing.
They're essentially zombies.
Right. They are dead but still walking. They need to die completely so something healthy can finally be born in their place.
So his advice is basically, let it burn.
Let it burn so something functional can replace it. The quote he uses is, "The old must burn for the new to rise." But the key is that you don't just sit there and watch the fire. You have to build a fortress while it's burning.
And this is where he gets into building the tribe. He mentions Dunbar's number here, and this section felt very practical, very tactical.
It is deeply tactical. He argues that you simply cannot survive the fourth turning alone as a rugged individual. The lone wolf myth is a lie. Humans aren't biologically wired for it. Reichel says every man needs to actively build a tribe of up to 150 capable, red-pilled men.
And that number isn't random.
No, that's Dunbar's number. It's the theoretical cognitive limit of how many stable social relationships a human can maintain.
But he's very clear in the text that this isn't just a fantasy football league or a drinking buddy club.
Not at all. It is a strict survival unit. He says you need men in your circle who can shoot, men who can build things, and men who can think critically. And you have to curate the circle with extreme prejudice.
Because if you have what he calls NPCs in your circle,
people who just blindly download and repeat whatever the mainstream media narrative is.
right, they are a massive liability.
Because when the real crunch comes, those are the people who will immediately sell you out to the mob to save themselves. You have to cut them out now.
He also introduces this concept called the hard thing doctrine.
The universe forces men to do hard things. That's his direct quote. His philosophy is that if you do not actively choose voluntary discomfort in your daily life, things like fasting, taking ice baths, training in martial arts, lifting heavy weights,
then the universe will inflict involuntary discomfort on you when the actual collapse happens.
Exactly. It's about physical and mental inoculation. You train yourself in the freezing cold voluntarily so you don't completely panic when the heating grid eventually fails.
It's essentially stoicism, but weaponized for the modern apocalypse.
Yes. And there is this incredibly powerful visual metaphor he uses near the very end of the book to tie all this together. It's a painting. The Oath of the Herati by Jacques-Louis David.
Describe that painting for the listeners who might not have seen it.
It depicts three Roman brothers standing together, saluting their father as they receive their swords for battle. The men are rigid, they are muscular, they are entirely focused on their duty, their tribe, and the state.
And the women in the painting.
In the corner of the canvas, the women are weeping. They are slumped over, completely overcome with fear and emotion. Riker says this painting perfectly encapsulates the ideal of the Iron Pill.
The men have to be the unbending structure.
Exactly. Men must provide the rigid order and stability, even while the emotional world is literally collapsing all around them.
That is a really stark image. It's definitely not a modern, progressive view of gender roles.
It's not supposed to be modern. It's meant to be ancient and primal. Riker is telling men to reclaim what he calls their divine sovereignty, to stop apologizing for their natural masculinity, to step up and become agents of absolute order in an increasingly chaotic world.
He practically ends the book with a manifesto. He writes, "Do not apologize. Reclaim sovereignty."
And this is where that war cry aspect we mentioned earlier really comes to the forefront. He directly tells the reader that they are the remnant. They are the guardians of the flame. It is a literal call to spiritual and physical arms.
And if you are listening to this and you want to join that vanguard, Riker actually has a Substack. You need to go follow him at Conrad N. Riker. That's at CONRADNRIKER. He calls it the digital headquarters for this ongoing intellectual crusade.
Absolutely. The ebook is the foundational manual, but the Substack is where you get the daily briefings. And I have to say it again, we have covered a lot of ground today, but we haven't covered everything.
Not even close.
To get the full breakdown on what he calls the epistemology of the red pill, his specific legal strategies for protecting yourself, and his rituals of renewal, you simply must buy Four Horsemen by Conrad Riker. You can get it right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Do it today. Do not wait until the internet goes down to figure this stuff out.
I want to share one final thought from the text that I think really ties his entire philosophy together. Riker says, the reckoning is not a punishment, it is a purification.
A purification.
Yes. I think that is the ultimate mindset shift he is trying to instill in his readers. He wants men to stop fearing the end of the current world and instead start actively preparing to build the next one.
That is an incredibly powerful place to leave the main discussion. But before we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to chew on, something that builds on Riker's work.
What's that?
Think about the digital footprint of that simp economy we discussed. Think about all those isolated men. What happens to the men who don't take the iron pill when the dust finally settles? When the grid goes down and those parasocial transactional relationships literally evaporate overnight, do those men just become a new underclass in whatever society emerges next?
That is a dark thought, but it fits perfectly with the reality of the fourth turning. If you don't build your value, you will be left behind.
Something to seriously explore on your own. If this deep dive resonated with you, if you felt that gnawing sensation we talked about at the very beginning, hit that like button right now, subscribe to the feed, and share this with a man in your life who desperately needs to hear it.
Help the algorithm promote substance over slop.
We will see you all in the next deep dive. Stay sovereign.